Today we're going to be having a conversation about how you can figure out what lights you will need for your next shoot. So if you're someone like me that's primarily shooting a lot of low-budget narrative projects, kind of DIY type of setups, then I'm sure you've experienced a situation where you show up on the day and you realize you don't have the right tools to accomplish the look that you're hoping for. Specifically meaning you maybe don't have powerful enough lights or just not the right kind of lighting and grip gear. At this current chapter in my personal working journey, 90% of the time, I don't have the luxury of getting production to rent some big 5-ton G&E package. The majority of jobs that I'm booking are booking me for my own camera package and whatever little grip and electric gear that I already have and can provide. So one way that I've been tackling this is by just applying some simple math, and I hope that this will help you prepare for your next narrative shoot as well. So the first step is probably the hardest one, and that's really just for low budget guys like me, but it would be really nice if you can have access to the location prior to the shooting day. Now I do realize that's not always an option, but if you can at least get pictures of the location or anything that will help you get a better understanding of the area, the set, the surroundings. It would be even better yet if you get actual measurements of the space. Anything that will allow you to have some communication with the director in figuring out the rough blocking of the scene. If you are able to go on an actual location scout, some tools that I would recommend are Artemis Pro, Helios, and a light meter. So Artemis Pro is a digital director's viewfinder for your iPhone or iPad. I can dial in the exact camera and lenses that I'm going to be shooting on, and I can figure out with the director right then and there what focal lengths I'm going to be using, and really you're pretty much making a live storyboard on the day. And then with my Sekonic LiteMaster Pro, I take ambient readings of the light in the space. It just helps me to get an idea of the overall room tone. And I take notes on what that ambient light is, because that ambient room tone is going to help us out later on down the road when we're deciding what lights and grip gear we want to use. The third option is Helios, which is made by the same company that makes Artemis. And Helios is really useful for those big exterior shots or for any jobs that involve windows where you're going to have to battle the sun. My favorite part of Helios is that you can track the sun's path in live view right there at the location, and it gives you a little finger, and the finger points directly wherever the sun is. But another cool part is you can jump in time, and you can track the sun's path of the actual day that you're going to be shooting in the future. So now that you have an idea of the space you're going to be working in, and you have an idea of the action that's going to take place, now you're going to have to start figuring out your shot design. Where exactly are you going to put your modifiers and your lights? But obviously before you do that, you're going to need to know what look you want to achieve with those lights. Some great resources for inspiration is ShotDeck and Google Images, or maybe even just real paintings. So now that you have those images in your brain and you've discussed with the director and you've both decided and agreed upon an aesthetic, now's the time you can start mastering and mapping out your shot design. An awesome tool that I use is called Shot Designer. So this is really cool for iOS. I'm not too sure how it works in the Android world, but I do know that it syncs up automatically across all my devices. So whatever project I'm working on, it pulls up on my iPad, my iPhone, and my MacBook Pro. And for the past 3 years, for about 90% of all the jobs I've done, I've always used Shot Designer. Disclaimer here, none of these apps I'm talking about have asked me to talk about them. I don't get a cut or a commission. I'm not an affiliate with any of these companies, of anyone that I'm talking about in this video today. I just legit use these apps and I find them really, really helpful in the pre-production process. The main reason why I always have used Shot Designer is because I don't like walking in blind on any narrative shoots. Now obviously in the documentary world, we know that is much, much different and you are always walking in blind. But when you're shooting narrative projects, that's the time to really try to shine and get some really solid footage for your reel. But of course, in order to make a shot design that is actually helpful and one that's going to benefit you, you're going to first need to figure out what lights and modifiers you're going to be using to help you achieve the look that you're after. So here's where all that math I talked about starts to finally come into play, and you're going to need to know some specific specs in order to do this successfully. The first one is you're going to need to know the rough measurements of the space you're going to be shooting in. Because if you know the action of your scene, then you will know where you can safely stage your lights. And then you're going to need to know the specs of the lights that you plan to use. I'm talking about their maximum output. And when we do this today, I'm going to be using lux, and I realize some people prefer foot candles, but for me, I find lux is just easier because it's more readily available across all the devices that I use. To help me further explain this, I'm going to be sharing this real-world example of a shoot that I had to prepare for just a few weeks ago. So this is a picture that was taken on a location scout. This is an exterior setting, it's a large amphitheater, and we planned to be shooting at nighttime. And so I had to do a little bit of digging and emailing back and forth to figure out some rough measurements of that stage and the stage wings. And the reason why I needed to know those measurements is because I needed to figure out how far away my lights were gonna be to make sure they were out of frame for the master wide shot. And from what I can recall, I believe the light had to be 25 feet away from talent, who was standing center stage. So now our next step is going to be deciding on what our camera settings are going to be. So as I said before, this was an exterior night shoot, and I knew I was going to be shooting on my Pocket 4K with the Metabones Ultra Speedbooster. And since it was such a large area at nighttime, I knew I wanted to be shooting at the next ISO tier. So I knew right out the gate I was going to be shooting at 1250 ISO in Blackmagic RAW and shooting at a T2 with my Contact Zeiss Cine lens. And for the most part, I lived at 24 frames per second and 180-degree shutter. Now another tool I have to make sure I account for when I'm figuring out exposure is filtration. And I did recently, within the past couple months, invest in an ADJ haze generator, but with the scope of this location and the time restraints, I decided that trying to control haze levels all night and keeping consistency just wasn't going to be ideal for our crew. So rather than using my haze generator, I decided to use one of my favorite filters that I own from Tiffin, which is the half fog. So you can kind of cheat having some consistent atmos throughout the night. So now finally, this is where the real calculations come into play, and to do all of this stuff that we've previously talked about, I use this awesome app called pCam Pro. It is full of awesome camera assist tools, but one of my favorites by far is the exposure tool. So in the app, I can dial in everything we just talked about, all the camera settings, what filter is on the lens, and once I do that, the app lets me know how much lux I need for proper exposure. Now, there is one important thing to take note of here. You'll notice that my ISO is set to 2500. And the reason for that is because both my light meter and the pCam Pro app don't know that I'm using the Metabones Ultra Speedbooster. So you always have to account for your Speedbooster when you're dialing in your exposure on something like a light meter or the pCam Pro app. And the easiest way I do it is by jumping up one full stop in ISO. And one full stop above 1250 is 2500. So right away we can see how that dual native ISO of the Pocket 4K along with the Metabones Ultra is really helping us out on this night exterior shoot. Now the next step, which is one of the biggest steps, is figuring out if your lights are powerful enough to provide you with the right amount of lux that is needed. One thing to keep in mind here is that the pCam app is letting us know how much lux is needed for proper exposure. So it's a good way to think of it as your key light. And then from there, you can decide if you want to be over or under. But obviously, if your light can't output the amount of lux that you need for proper exposure to begin with, then you're going to have some problems right out the gate. So it is so important that you know the specs of your lights. For this scenario, I knew I was going to use my Aputure 300D as my key light. So from there, all you have to do is Google your light with the word specs behind it. So in my case, Aputure 300D specs. For me, I had to make sure it was the Mark I version, and here we see 48,000 lux at a half a meter. But as I said before, that Aputure 300D needs to be at least 25 feet away to clear the frame for that master wide shot. And 25 feet is around 7.5 meters. So here's where you'll need to know a little something about what is called the inverse square law. So basically, every time you double the distance of your light from the subject, you're losing 3/4 of the previous output. For instance, as soon as we take this 300D from a half a meter to 1 meter, we've now gone from 48,000 lux to 12,000 lux. And then if we go from 1 meter to 2 meters, now we're only working with 3,000 lux. So every time you double the distance, you have to divide the lux by 4. So let's keep going, 2 meters to 4 meters, now we're working with only 750 lux. But we gotta get all the way to 7.5 meters. So let's double it again. 4 meters to 8 meters, now we have 187.5 lux that we can realistically work with. But if we go back to our pCam, we know we are more than safe because we actually only need 26 lux for proper exposure with our current camera settings. But obviously I didn't plan on blasting that 300D straight at the talent without putting any diffusion in front of it. So for instance, I knew I was going to be using a grid diffusion. And with that grid diffusion, you lose about 2 full stops of light. So you gotta go back into the pCam again and you adjust the f-stop, change it from an f2 to an f4. And now you'll see we would need 104 lux. But we're still good because we know when that 300D is 8 meters away that we still have 187.5 lux to work with. But now what if we were shooting on a camera that didn't have a dual native ISO like our Pocket 4K? Like for instance, let's say we were shooting on a camera that lives at 800 ISO, and since that's the native ISO, we just decided no, we're going to live at this 800 ISO. Well, now you can see you would need 325 lux. And now you would have some problems. You'd either have to get a lens that is much faster than a T2, or you'd have to go with a lighter diffusion on your key light. Or you could just decide, is it okay for this particular scene that we're shooting to be 1 or 2 stops under? Now for my actual scenario here, there were a couple times where I overcranked to 48 frames per second to get some slower, dreamier shots. And now you'll see that by doing that, I actually now needed 208 lux for proper exposure. However, I wanted to remain consistency with my previous 104 lux for all those scenes where I was shooting at 24 frames. So rather than messing with my light levels, I just changed my ISO in camera from 1250 to 2500, which with the Speedbooster is more like shooting at 5000 ISO. But you'll see by doing that, I now maintain consistent exposure with all my previous shots of 104 lux. And this is also one of the bonuses when shooting in RAW because ISO is essentially just metadata anyways. So there you have it, folks. I really hope this video wasn't too confusing for you. I hope it is helpful for you. And if you're into this kind of content and you want to see the real behind the scenes and really dive in onto this particular shoot that I shared a little tiny bit of, then the Dog Times Patreon is the place to be. My YouTube channel is way too small to have any sponsors or anything like that, so without the Patreon community, I just wouldn't be able to stay consistent with my YouTube. And right now I want to give a gigantic shout out and huge thank you to all of my awesome supporters of the Dog Times Patreon. These are the names you see on the screen, and if you yourself end up joining the Dog Times community, then I'll see you over on our private Discord chat.